Will, thank you very much for joining me. Now, this Iron Dome, that is a feat of some engineering. I mean, I was talking to Charlie about the fact that in Israel they are able to continue, despite heavy bombardment still. Obviously, the bombardment is going both ways, but they're able to protect themselves with it. Can you talk us through a little bit about what kind of technology that is?
Sure. I mean, it's unprecedented technology. They've had it in place for quite some time, but in its literal sense, it creates a dome of protection over Tel Aviv and over key sort of locations in Israel. And how it works is one of the ways that Hamas has launched attacks sporadically into Israel has been to send what we call indirect fires. This is mortars. These are small missiles, short-range missiles, which will simply be sent in, which will not necessarily be targeted at anything specific. They will just be indiscriminate in terms of just trying to create damage. Now, the dome provides this sort of protective measure to counteract, obviously, any of those missiles coming over and intercept them in the sky before they can actually hit the ground. So in its most simplistic sense, that's how it works. But the Iron Dome didn't work, inevitably, with this attack, which was very well coordinated, very well strategized by Hamas at the last weekend, where they came in under radar, they came in undetected,
That's right.
and were able to obviously launch this horrendous and barbaric attack.
And that was presumably because they were under the radar. The attacks were too low, which is why they
used paragliders, for example, and they came in on those with GPMGs, you know, with...
What's a GPMG?
A general-purpose machine gun, you know, large machine guns, 50 cals, which can cause absolute devastation. It's not small arms fire at all. These were meant to cause huge casualties. And I think the one thing that we can't detract from, regardless of everything that's happened before and whatever the conflict has constituted in the past, this attack by Hamas is not an attack by Palestine. It's an attack by a terrorist group. And this terrorist group we're looking not to combat in a very traditional sense, military against military. This was against innocent civilians, defenseless civilians who had no option. Their whole objective was to cause as much traumatic devastation as they possibly could. This is absolutely the playbook of Islamic State, for example.
Yeah, I mean, and it is a frightening way to behave as well. And it's a mindset that when we look at it, we think, well, how awful, how could you do that? But it feels as though there's been a level of indoctrination with people who are able to commit such atrocities and appear to have no empathy.
Yeah, I mean, this is always a challenge. It's whether it be Al-Qaeda, whether it be Islamic State, whether it be Boko Haram, whether, you know, which Al-Shabaab, any one of these terrorist groups, their indoctrination of their supporters will be those that are disenchanted, those that are displaced, those that have often very little to obviously achieve out of life. Quite often when we've seen with Al-Qaeda attacks, for example, historically, many of their recruits and certainly many of the lone actors will be individuals that have had even low-level criminality in their past. These are people on a path to nowhere, and therefore they've given a purpose because they become vulnerable. And as we've seen with the grooming that's been done online of individuals that have gone to a particular terrorist agenda, you know, these are individuals which were susceptible. And where the terrorists play very cleverly and very carefully is identifying those that are vulnerable and more susceptible to that recruitment.
And of course, the Gaza Strip, it feels like an ideal breeding ground because it is often it's often seen as a prison. People often classify it as almost like a land prison, and it feels like that there doesn't seem to be a lot of hope for some of the young people there, although obviously Hamas are not the general population.
No, exactly.
This is just, you know, we're dealing with disenfranchised people who are in a situation where they simply, you know, obviously they've been fed some doctrine that makes them feel this way, and they want to...
I mean, I've spent time in Israel. I've been to Tel Aviv. It's a beautiful city, and I've spent a lot of time in the region. There's good and bad to be said for both sides, and there is always going to be, you know, one side, two sides to every story, and somewhere in the middle is the truth. Now, as you always know, what you have is in this boiling pot or smelting pot is Hamas, and this is an evil element which very few people actually recognise cause as much harm to the Palestinians as they do to the Israelis. This is that entity which, as we're seeing with the evacuation, they're taking civilians, they're using them as shields, obviously, against the Israelis. They're using hospitals, they're using schools for weapon caches to stow munitions and various other sort of measures that they can utilise in their counterattack to, obviously, the Israeli forces. These people do not work by any ethical playbook whatsoever.